George Herbert Walker Bush was born on June 12, 1924 in Milton, Massachusetts. The role of leadership sparked in him when he became a student leader at Phillips Academy in Andover. He was raised learning the importance of public service and giving back to society, so on his 18th birthday he enlisted in the Navy and became the youngest pilot. He flew 58 combat missions in World War II and received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his bravery. After the war, he decided to go to college and study economics at Yale University from 1945 to 1948. After college, he moved his family to Texas, where he opened up his own oil business. He became interested in politics because his father was a Connecticut senator back in 1952. Bush's political career began when he became a Republican Party chairman for his local town of Harris County, Texas. He unsuccessfully ran for a Senate position twice in 1964 and 1970, but in 1967 he served 2 terms in the House of Representatives and represented Texas. In 1971, he was appointed by Nixon to be a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He did that until 1973 when he became a chairman of the Republican National Committee. After about a year of that position, he moved on to become a chief to U.S. liaison office in People's Republic of China until 1976, and then the director of the CIA for a year. He spent the next 3 years planning for the 1980 election, but lost to Reagan in the Republican election because he was unable to connect with the average American, since he was a rich Ivy League alumni who met the stereotypes of a privileged New England background. Instead, he was Reagan's running mate and served 2 terms with him as vice president, before winning the 1988 election, becoming the first sitting vice president to be elected president since 1837.
Thing of all, we will turn to the only resource we have that in times of need always grows, the goodness and the courage of the American people.
During Bush's presidency, he passed the Disabilities Act of 1990, the Clean Air Act Amendment of 1990, the Immigration Act of 1990, and appointed David Schauder and Clarence Thomas to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Americans Disability Act prohibits the discrimination of people with disabilities in place of employment, transportation, public places, communications, and government activity. The Clean Air Act Amendments of 1990 regulates air emissions from stationary and mobile sources to protect public health and public welfare. It regulates emissions of hazardous air pollutants. The Immigration Act of 1990 increased the amount of people able to immigrate into the U.S. from 500,000 to 700,000. This act enabled the removal of AIDS from the list of diseases that would prevent you from coming into the country. Many people would argue that Bush didn't do much domestically during his presidency, and they're partly right. In his campaign, Bush promised not to raise taxes, even with the national debt raising fast. Bush found himself struggling to balance the budget and reduce the deficit without having to add taxes. Therefore, he didn't have much room for big domestic projects and programs.
Starting in 1989, Bush began his task of dealing with foreign affairs. After the Chinese government killed innocent protesters, Bush had to decide how to approach the issue. He decided to pose limited sanctions in China and sent in the Secretary of State to repair any damaged relationships with the Chinese government. Next, the crisis with Panama took the stage. Manuel Noriega, once a worker in the CIA, took power as a dictator in Panama. Bush wanted to take him out of power in order to help innocent civilians and save them from government brutality. In December 1989, Bush sent in troops to invade Panama and successfully captured Noriega, who later went to prison in Miami. The last foreign affair Bush dealt with was the Persian Gulf War. After Iraq invaded our ally Kuwait for oil, Bush sent in troops to force Iraqi forces out. This operation was successful and there weren't any high casualties. The success of the operation helped to make the memories of the Vietnam War fade. Near the end of his presidency, he called for the New World Order, which declared that there would be much more effort into freeing the country of the threat of terror and securing peace.
Elected in 1989, Bush was one of the most qualified presidents to hold office. He had previously won the vice president for Ronald Reagan during Reagan's 8 years in office. Regarding foreign affairs, he was very successful. However, domestically, Americans
consider him to be unsuccessful. Within America, he passed the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Clean Air Act. These would come to be known as his most notable reforms. Unfortunately, during his 4 years in office, he was held back by the limited budget deficit, a Democratic-controlled Congress, and a limited federal revenue. He broke his promise to very conservative Republicans that he would not raise taxes and cut military spending. Growing up in New England, born into a very wealthy family, Bush was hardly in touch with the average American. Many complained that he lacked a vision for the future of America and did little to communicate his plans with the public. Due to the fact that he was uncomfortable with bold and dramatic changes, he went with a more calm and stable approach to his presidency. As one of Bush's most successful domestic reforms, the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 is closely related to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Americans Disabilities Act of 1990 expanded upon the Civil Rights Act, prohibiting discrimination of those with a disability in employment, transportation, public accommodations, communications, and government activities. The Civil Rights Act of 1965 outlawed segregation in public places, such as theaters and restaurants, and banned discrimination in unemployment.
On the other hand, Bush took control in Panama and worked to rid the country of its brutal dictator and helped the people escape an oppressive government by doing so. As Bush sent troops to Kuwait once Iraq had invaded, this was the beginning of our presence in the Middle East. Some argue that Bush is the reason why we remain fighting there, since he was the first one to send troops in. However, he successfully helped our ally Kuwait, and the battle won there was something that Americans praised him for.